Okay, let's unpack this. Try and cast your mind back just a few years. Remember a world where, bustling streets were just normal?
Seems like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it?
It really does, where shaking someone's hand wasn't even a second thought. And masks were, well, strictly for Halloween, maybe doctors.
Exactly.
Then, almost overnight, it felt like the world just changed, fundamentally. Because of COVID-19, cities emptied out, handshakes vanished, masks became, well, part of the daily uniform for many.
A huge shift.
A huge shift. So today, we're doing a deep dive specifically into your source material, basically, notes and an outline from a video called How COVID-19 Changed Life Around the World Talks Without Borders. And our mission, really, is to go through this material, pull out the most important insights, and understand just how life did fundamentally shift across the globe, according to this source.
And what's really interesting about this source material is how it breaks down the impact. It doesn't just look at one thing. It covers several key areas. Things like the massive changes in education, how work and the economy got completely reshaped,
Okay.
the impact on mental health and community, which was huge. Then there's the whole complex story around science, trust, and vaccines. And finally, how it really sort of spotlighted global inequalities.
That sounds like a really good roadmap from the source. It covers a lot of ground.
It does. It gives us a framework.
Okay, so let's jump right into that first area the source points to, education. I mean, that was dramatic, wasn't it? An almost overnight revolution. Schools closed, boom. Learning just looked completely different for millions and millions of kids.
Absolutely. And this is where the source gives some really striking examples, specific ones that show not just the scale of change, but the disparities too.
Like what?
Well, it points out how in Kenya, for instance, kids suddenly had to rely on radio broadcasts for their lessons.
Wow, radio.
Yeah, which is a pretty stark contrast to, say, South Korea, where the source note schools went fully digital almost immediately.
Right. And here in the U.S., the source highlights how Zoom classrooms became the new, well, sometimes chaotic, normal for so many families. But what the source seems to really hammer home here is that this wasn't just about, adopting new technology. It really showed both the potential of digital learning
Sure, the potential was there.
and the harsh reality of inequality, like
Yeah.
access to decent internet or having the right devices or even just a quiet place to actually focus and study.
Exactly. That's a key point the source makes using those specific country examples to show how technology bumped up against existing infrastructure and, well, social conditions. It wasn't a level playing field.
No, definitely not. It
Yeah.
certainly makes you stop and think, doesn't it? I mean, reflecting back, how did you see education change around you during that time? Did you witness those kinds of really rapid and sometimes, uneven shifts firsthand?
It's a good question to reflect on.
Okay, so from the classroom, let's move to the workplace. The source also dives into the huge changes that hit work and the global economy. And this felt, well, seismic for so many people, but in really different ways depending on where you live.
Oh, absolutely. The source is quite clear about highlighting immense job losses in certain regions. It mentions millions facing major job disruption or outright loss in places like India and across Latin America.
That's dark.
It is. But then the source contrasts that, doesn't it, with the rapid rise of remote work culture. That really took hold, especially in parts of Europe and North America.
Yeah, suddenly the home was the office for a huge chunk of the workforce there.
And the source details other knock-on effects from that, like, delivery apps booming because everyone's staying home.
Right, I remember that.
While at the same time, physical office spaces started shrinking. Companies began rethinking if they even needed all that space.
The source seems pretty definite on this point, suggesting these aren't just temporary blips. Its conclusion seems to be that work, for many people, will just never look the same again.
That really feels like the core takeaway the source is drawing from those economic shifts. It wasn't just a pause, it was a change to the actual structure and future of work itself.
Yeah, makes sense. Thinking about your own situation, how did your work, or maybe just the economy you saw around you, feel different during that time? What were the signs you noticed of these changes the source is talking about?
Everyone seemed to have a story about that.
For sure. And so shifting gears a bit from the sort of practicalities of work and school, the source also takes a really important look at the human element, the impact on mental health, how we stayed connected as communities or, struggled with isolation.
And this is a point the source makes quite starkly. It notes that loneliness, it just skyrocketed for a lot of people during lockdowns and periods of physical distancing.
Yeah, that resonates. But what's interesting is how the source then kind of pivots, doesn't it? It shows that it wasn't just a story of isolation, it also sparked incredible innovation, really, in how people connected despite all the barriers.
Yes. And the source gives those really memorable, almost heartwarming examples sometimes.
Like the singing from balconies.
Exactly. It mentions the Italians singing from balconies to lift spirits, and how things like, Zoom reunions or virtual happy hours suddenly became routine ways for families and friends all over the world to stay in touch.
It felt like that physical distance almost forced us to find new ways, often really creative ways, to keep that sense of community going.
Totally. And the really significant point the source seems to pull out here is that this whole collective experience, the isolation, the anxiety, but also the need to find new ways to connect it, genuinely pushed mental health into the global conversation.
Made it a priority.
Yeah, made it a public priority in a way it really hadn't been, perhaps, for a long time.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. Thinking back on that time, what were some of the surprising ways you saw people connect or adapt? Or how did you personally navigate that feeling of isolation the source brings up?
Always interesting to hear individual experiences there.
Definitely. Okay, next up, the source dives into what feels like a really complex and sometimes contentious story, science and public trust, especially how that played out with the vaccines.
Right. And the source kind of presents two sides of this coin. On one hand, it frames the incredibly rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines as a clear, a triumph of science.
Yeah, record
A change in record time, unprecedented global collaboration.
time.
It definitely acknowledges that massive scientific lift.
But then, almost in the same breath, the source brings in this critical counterpoint. It argues that while the science moved fast, the rollout, the public response, really exposed these deep existing issues of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in science itself, among populations worldwide.
Absolutely. The source's analysis seems to be that the fight wasn't just against the virus. It was also a huge battle against misinformation, spreading like wildfire. And it even points to specific examples, mentioning challenges faced in places like Canada and Cameroon, just to illustrate how that misinformation directly complicated the public health efforts on the ground.
It really shows how quickly false narratives could grab hold and the real world impact that had, even though we had these scientific breakthroughs happening.
It's a really potent illustration from the source's viewpoint of how scientific progress isn't in a vacuum. It's tangled up with societal factors like trust, like the information people are getting.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you personally experience that kind of tension between the scientific achievement and then these challenges with trust and just navigating the flood of information?
It was certainly a lot to process for everyone.
Okay, so finally, let's turn to a theme that the source seems to view as really critical. How the pandemic didn't just affect the world, but how it, maybe more importantly, exposed the global inequality that was already there.
Yes, the source makes a very strong argument on this point.
Mm-hmm.
It basically says that COVID-19 shone this harsh, unavoidable light on disparities that already existed, made them impossible to ignore.
And it backs us up with specific, sometimes pretty difficult examples.
It does. The source points out how richer nations were able to quickly secure and, in some cases, hoard vaccine supplies,
Mm-hmm.
while many countries with fewer resources were left waiting significantly longer just to even start vaccinating their people.
And the source notes this wasn't only about vaccines, was it?
No, not at all. It highlighted differences in access to really fundamental resources, things like, quality healthcare itself, the digital tools people needed for remote work and school,
Right.
even basic medical supplies like oxygen.
Yeah.
It just revealed these deep fault lines in our global systems.
So these weren't new problems, the source is saying, but the pandemic just ripped the covers off, basically, for everyone to see.
Exactly. And the source uses this quite poignant phrase to sum it up. It says the pandemic showed just how united the world really was, or perhaps how divided it actually remained underneath it all.
Wow. That's a challenging perspective the source puts forward.
Hmm.
How does that view on global inequality, drawn right from the material we're discussing, challenge or maybe reinforce your own understanding of the pandemic's full impact?
It definitely adds a critical layer to the story.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, looking back at the source's overall take, it seems to frame the pandemic as this shared global crisis, one that showed both our fragility, facing a new threat, but also at the same time, remarkable resilience, people finding ways forward, adaptability.
Right. And the source kind of concludes by leaving us with these big lingering questions, doesn't it? Like, what if we actually learn from this completely unprecedented period?
The big question.
And maybe the most crucial one, Will we genuinely be better prepared for whatever the next global challenge might be?
Those really are the questions that stick with you. So, based on all the insights we've pulled from your source material today, it's worth taking a moment to consider. What specific lessons do you believe the world has actually managed to learn from this time of huge change? And maybe more importantly, what still feels critically important for us collectively, for individual understanding, or just for being better prepared next time based on the perspectives shared in your sources?